don't want to start with a raspy voice, but good morning. As Nikolai mentioned, there we go. My name is Dyneco Gibson, and I want to thank you for inviting me. Again, I am the Director of Campaigns and Engagement with the New PA project, our New Pennsylvania project. I'm a mom, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a friend, and most recently I've become an activist. I never saw myself as a keynote speaker, but after today, I can add that to my list. I have you all to thank for that. I am more of a person to have a two-way conversation about the world that we live in and where we are today. And so, my first question is, where are we today? Well, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer. And when we talk about Freedom Summer, we have to first define what freedom is. Freedom, the power, the right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. The right, a moral document or legal entitlement to have or obtain something or to act in a certain way. So my mother was born in Canton, Mississippi, and she often talked about picking cotton, and we would hear these stories all the time, and her having to drink from segregated water fountains. I grew up hearing these stories, how Black folks were unfairly treated, and I definitely feel connected to this topic of Freedom Summer. The Freedom Summer 1964 campaign was a voter education and registration that was organized by groups including the Congress of Racial Equity and the Student Nonviolent Coalition, which often is referred to as SNCC. In the summer of 1964, more than 1,000 volunteers and activists went to Mississippi to register Black voters who were denied access to the ballot. Freedom Summer volunteers included college students, teachers, clergy, lawyers, activists who attended trainings. And so when I think about our staff, we talk about trainings back then, and that our staff, we spend a lot of time training them to be able to do this work, to go into schools and colleges and churches and being able to provide civic engagement, civic education, and being able to provide information that folks need so they can get out and vote. And so the purpose of Freedom Summer was the 1964 voter registration drives aimed at increasing the number of registered Black voters in Mississippi. Over 700 mostly white volunteers joined African Americans in Mississippi to fight against voter intimidation and discrimination at the polls. By one account, during the Mississippi summer, there were 80 civil rights workers beaten, 1,000 arrests, 30 Black homes and businesses burned, 4 project workers killed. Now imagine being able to just go out and do what we do, our staff do on a daily basis, and having to face being targeted, being killed, being beaten, and simply for registering folks to vote. And we want to make sure, as we're celebrating the 60th year anniversary, that we don't have those problems. But certainly, as an organization, we worry about those things. There are times that we go out and folks are yelling at us and they're screaming at us, and they don't feel like we should be there. And so often it makes us think, how far have we come if we're still experiencing some of those issues? Want to roll that video? And so I'm going to share a video with you. I was a little clip. I was on Lincoln University's college campus. It was homecoming weekend, and we were registering students to vote. And a great-grandmother was there with her student, or with her great-grandchild, and she shared this information with us.
Okay. It's important to vote because it's the only way you have of picking which one to say, which one to do. We want to represent you. And when I go back, when I think of my ancestors, and especially my grandfather, who, when they first was going to allow black people to vote, my grandfather was trying to help someone through the window so they could vote. He got shot in the head. Didn't kill him, but he was shot in the head and had seizures the rest of his life from that. And he used to always say, well, it was worth it. It was worth it because he was trying to. That was when they first would allow black people to vote. And of course, it took a long time after that, even that, for them to get the right to vote. And so we should exercise that because we never know what people went through to get us to that right, inside right.
And so when I heard that story, it just made me think of how important the work is that we do and how important it is for folks to get out and vote. So I'm gonna ask a question for everyone in the room, folks close and folks around the perimeter. How many folks are registered to vote? By show of hands. So we've got a few hands. There are some hands that are not up. We want to encourage folks to vote. And we have staff here that are here today that can get you registered because your voice is important. It is powerful and it helps with change. And so prior to the enactment of the Voter Rights Act of 1965, there were several efforts to stop the disenfranchisement of black voters by southern states. Besides the above mentioned, there were literacy tests, poll tax, and other tests that they would have African Americans do to make sure that they were eligible to vote. So I'm going to do an exercise. If the few of you that are here, if you could stand up for me, you'd be willing to stand up. So I'm going to say, if you can participate, that's fine. If you have glasses, sit down. If you drive a motorcycle, sit down. If you don't know how to drive, sit down. So if we think about these are, if a test was conducted like this, you see that there's only a few people standing. And if those few people were the ones that were able to decide on how we were able to vote or what we were voting on, or this would be their reason, or this would allow them to vote, we think about how unfair that is. You may sit. Thank you for participating. I wanted you to have an idea of how some black folks were treated, if they couldn't read, or if they couldn't, the literacy test, all kinds of things that they had to perform to be able to vote. And so we want to make sure that it is important that everyone has that right, that folks, even that may say, I can't vote because I have a record, or because, I'm not sure who I want to vote for. We want to make sure that you are exercising your right to vote, again, because it's very important. And so, besides the above mentioned literacy tests, there were poll tax, and I think I mentioned that. There was risk of harassment, intimidation, physical violence, and when they tried to register to vote. As a result, very few African Americans were registered to vote, and they had very little, if any, political power, either locally or nationally. In the 1950s, the civil rights movement increased pressure on the federal government to protect the voting rights of racial minorities. In 1957, Congress passed the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This legislation authorized the Attorney General to use for injunctive relief on behalf of persons whose 15th Amendment rights were denied. Although these acts help empower courts to remedy violations of federal voting rights, strict legal standards made it difficult for the Department of Justice to successfully pursue litigation. For example, to win a discrimination lawsuit against a state that maintained a literacy test, the department needed to prove that the rejected voter registration applications of racial minorities were comparable and accepted applications of whites. And so many times we see that as we are registering folks to vote, if there are things that they're leaving off, maybe their signature is not there, or a date is missing, that is grounds to kind of throw out those applications. And so we as an organization have been fighting and joining forces with other organizations to make sure that we are fighting for the rights of everyone to be able to vote, especially folks who may not really understand the process, who may not fill out the ballot perfectly, but to be able to have their ballots and their voice heard. Between 1957 and 1964, the African American voter registration rate in the South increased only marginally, even though the department litigated 71 voting rights lawsuits. Efforts to stop the disenfranchisement by the southern states had achieved only modest success over and in some areas, and had provided almost entirely ineffectual because the Department of Justice efforts to eliminate discriminatory election practices by litigation. These cases were seen on a case-by-case basis and had been unsuccessful in opening up registration process. So meaning that a lot of times there were lawsuits, but nothing was done, that they still created an opportunity to discriminate and throw out those ballots that were either cast or those forms that were filled out. Congress responded to rampant discrimination against racial minorities in public accommodations and government services by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act included some voter rights protection. It required registrants to equally administer literacy tests in writing to each voter and to accept applications that contained minor errors. And it created a rebuttal that persons with a 6th grade education were significantly, illiterate to vote. And so today, 60 years later, that is still happening, where folks may not be able to read. They may not, for whatever reason, need some assistance. And we want to be in a space where we are providing education as well as assistance to folks that need it, that we are not discriminating. So when I just did this exercise where I had folks stand up and sit down based off of certain things, that's certainly something that we don't want to go back to. And we want to make sure that folks that want to register to vote, that folks that want to vote, that are folks that are eligible to vote, that they are getting the proper support and what they need. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is a landmark piece of federal legislation in the United States that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson during the height of the Civil Rights Movement on August 6, 1965. And Congress later attended the Act 5 times to expand its protection. Designed to enforce the voting rights protection by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, the act sought to secure the right to vote for racial minorities throughout the country, especially in the South. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the act is considered to be the most effective piece of federal civil rights legislation ever enacted in the country. The National Archives and Records Administration stated the Voter Rights Act of 1965 was the most significant statutory change in the relationship between the federal government and the state governments in the area of voting since the Reconstruction period. In Pennsylvania, excuse me, in Pennsylvania, there are 2.1 million Pennsylvanians that are registered to vote, or who are not registered to vote or at risk of being rolled off the polls. And we want to make sure, as an organization, that we are closing that gap. The New Pennsylvania Project is a voting rights organization with a year-round primary focus on voter registration, civic education, and mobilization. MPP centers historically disenfranchised and often neglected Black folks, Indigenous and other people of color, immigrant communities, and the youth in our work. So that's all of you in this room. Our organization classifies you as a youth between 17 and 35. We do this work through civic engagement. We ensure all eligible voters feel compelled to exercise their freedom to vote in the Commonwealth. This organization was formed because there is still a need to get people to vote, especially in the communities we center. Oftentimes it's due to the mistrust in the political process, and many believe the system has truly failed them. My second question is, what is your why? We ask our staff that all the time. What is your why for doing this work? Why is it that you get up every day when you're going out to colleges and high schools and senior centers on a rainy day? What is your why? Why do you get out and do this work? And for me, my why is that I look at my daughter and I want to make sure, as we 60 years later, that she has the rights that are important, or that I'm fighting for her rights because she's not old enough to vote, and that I want to make sure that her voice is heard, and that I am fighting for a fair and just world for her to live in. It is also important that I am selecting candidates that will make decisions that will impact my daughter's life in a positive way. Every election, I take her with me. It's become a habit to let her know that twice a year we have 2 elections, and that both of them are equally important to get out and cast your ballot. My third and final question is, what will you do to fight for the rights and freedoms of others and those in your communities and outside of your communities? The call to action, as they did back in 1964, is to assist with voter registration in any way you can. Talk to your family and friends about the importance of registering folks to vote. Make sure you are registered to vote and your information is up to date, and to show up to the polls. So not only do we want to register folks to vote, we want to make sure that people go to the polls on November 5th and cast a ballot. And so we still have work to do. You might ask, what can we do? There's only a few days leading up to November 5th. I'm glad you asked. Again, I'm going to encourage folks to mobilize. And what does that look like? That means getting together with groups and figuring out how you can get your peers registered to vote, making a plan to go to the polls, and checking your status. Many times, I can't tell you how often that we come across folks that think that they are registered to vote, and we pull up check their status, and it says inactive. We want to make sure before the deadline, October 21st, that everyone is registered at your current address, your information is up to date, and that you are ready to cast your ballot November 5th. And then you can make sure your friends are registered. That's really important. So if you're registered, talk to one or two friends and make sure that they are registered as well. And making a plan to vote and go into the polls. Doing it together. Earlier in my speech, I said I became an activist 2 years ago when joining this organization. But I guess I can say I've always been an activist. In some kind of way, it's in my DNA. Thank you for listening. Have a great evening.